Starting Monday, law enforcement agencies and the judiciary will start taking procedural steps to close criminal cases related to the standoff. The law takes effect on the 17th of February, and criminal charges against 268 suspects will be dropped. 108 criminal cases will also be closed.
Joining us now is Mikhailo Vinnytsky, a Kiev-based social commentator and academic. Welcome to the programme. Is this true? Is the government, do you believe, will it drop charges against all these protesters who have been jailed?
Yes, it looks like that's part of the deal that was somehow negotiated in backroom politics between the opposition and the regime. But I think that this is too early to say that the protests are over and that the current conflict is over, because one of the demands of the protesters on the streets was to close the criminal cases that were brought up, usually on trumped-up charges. The other demand, which is much more important, is the prosecution of those in the police forces that are responsible for undue violence and basically brutality. And there's been no movement on that yet, nor has there been any movement on the basic demand of new elections.
So where do you think it goes next?
Well, I think certainly tomorrow is going to be a key day, because Parliament is back in session, and apparently there's going to be an attempt to change the Constitution tomorrow to reduce some of the powers of the presidency and to try to get away from sort of an authoritarian kind of system that's evolved over the last 3 years. That will be a key event, but it doesn't seem to me like the protesters are going anywhere. The key demands are three, and that was to close criminal cases and end sort of persecution of people on the streets. The second was to have early elections, and the third was to prosecute those that are responsible for police brutality. So far we've got one of three, and none of the protesters seem to be budging until all three are actually, we'll see some movement on all three.
And what about ordinary life in Kiev and the rest of Ukraine? How is that continuing or not?
Well, the economy is a mess. The currency has devalued over the last week by about 15%. The imports as a result of that have gotten very, very expensive, which includes petrol, which includes sort of basic foodstuffs very often. So the economy is not doing well at all. And now it's a question of, and this goes back to where this whole revolution or social conflict, social upheaval really started. Who will be the side that will pull, that will actually be, I guess, the financial aid, who will provide the financial aid package, if you like? Is it going to be Russia with all of the strings attached? Or is it going to be the IMF and the European Union with all the strings attached on that side? In other words, we're back to a scenario where geopolitics seems to be pulling Ukraine in either direction, and in the meantime, people on the streets are protesting regarding local issues.
Okay, thanks ever so much for joining us. That's Mikhailo Vinnytsky, a Kiev-based social commentator.
Scientists are developing so-called intelligent robots by copying animal behavior. Researchers at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, meeting in Chicago, said that robots of the future are likely to be more like small animals rather than the humanoid butlers portrayed in science fiction. Our science correspondent is there and has gone to meet some of them.
Introducing Mabel, the robot housemaid.
In the 1970s, this is how we imagined robots to be in the future.
She'll bring your morning tea brewed just how you like it.
40 years on, and this is how they've turned out. Tiny robot ants. Not dusting or making tea, but scuttling along, trying to find their way home. But why build robots based on ants? Their creator, Professor Barbara Webb of Edinburgh University, explains.
If you've ever tried to build a robot yourself, you can't help but be amazed when you now look at an animal, even a very simple animal, and how well it interacts with the world, how many competencies it has, how compact it is.
Professor Webb spent several weeks studying a type of ant in Spain. She was amazed that it could process complex visual information in its tiny brain. And so back at the lab, she reproduced it in robot form.
Ants are fantastic navigators. They remember what they see in the way that we might recognize what we see when we learn our way around a new city. But they do all of it with a brain that's smaller than the head of a pin and with very poor vision. And so we're really interested to try and understand and replicate their capabilities.
Meanwhile, in Chicago, Professor Malcolm McIver became enamored with another little creature.
The inspiration is a group of fish that live in the rivers of the Amazon. And those rivers are very, very murky. So as a result, they've had to evolve a different way to sense. What they do is they generate a weak electric field around their body, and they're able to navigate and also communicate and hunt using that field.
So he took some back to his lab at Northwestern University in Chicago, and he showed me how their remarkable natural electric fields work.
If we dip the wires from a speaker into the tank, that electric field gets translated into sound.
The fish use these fields rather like radar to sense their surroundings. Professor McIver has made some robot fish that mimic the real ones.
So one of the technologies, which is sensing with electrical fields, is extremely practical for outfitting on underwater vehicles, for fixing oil spills, for a whole host of situations where right now we need to use human divers, and it's extremely dangerous, and essentially they go around just touching with their hands.
It seems that increasingly, robot builders are drawing their inspiration from the animal kingdom. So what are robots going to be like in the future?
We're not going to have one robot like in iRobot that, does everything for us in a human-like way. What we want is targeted devices that can do special tasks for us in simple ways. In the home, I think there's going to be more and more ways in which they can maybe do bits and pieces of cleaning for us. So maybe instead of just being restricted to the floor, they'll be able to crawl over the sofa and suck up the dust, not scare the pets, hopefully.
So no robot servants in the future. Some may say, thank goodness.
Mabel will make 1976 a real leisure year. Buy Mabel now.
And that report was by our science correspondent, Palab Ghosh.
I'd buy Mabel now still, I think. Let's go to Australia. Big story brewing there. It's been revealed that Rupert Murdoch's News Corp received a tax rebate of $880 million from the Australian government after winning a long-running battle with the country's tax authorities. The Sydney Morning Herald, which is, by the way, a Murdoch-owned newspaper, has come out with some pretty strong criticism about the payout. Its headline says, Murdoch tax win blows hole in federal budget. It points out that the amount of money paid back to News Corp, nearly $1 billion Australian dollars, is the same amount the government has said it will need to cut as it tries to rein in a big budget deficit. Some strong comment on social media on this. For example, Chris Richards tweets, "This is a scandal, an absolute scandal. Murdoch escapes $900 million tax bill. Aussie budget imperiled." News Corp have declined to comment so far.
You're listening to Newsday from the BBC World Service with Nkemi Fedrica and Tom Hagler. In a moment, we'll be going to California to hear about the state's worst drought in a century and how this is impacting on the agriculture industry and a situation which could put millions of Californians out of work. Our main headlines this hour: United Nations experts say North Koreans have suffered unspeakable atrocities at the hands of the state, and that's in a report to be published later today. Islamist militants in northern Nigeria have been accused of slaughtering more than 100 people in a raid on a village. An amnesty comes into force today for anti-government protesters in Ukraine, as you heard earlier on in the program. And 12 Years a Slave has been named Best Film of the BAFTA Awards here in London. And that's seen as an indicator of success to come in the Oscars.
Let's get the sports news now with Johnny Bryan.
Many thanks, Tom. 8 days on from losing 5-1 to Liverpool at Anfield, Arsenal dumped the Reds out of the FA Cup. Sonogo brings it down, hits the